Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Steve Ward. On the High Strangeness Factor, we explore all aspects of the paranormal and the unexplained. We look into events from the past as well as the present, and we seek out patterns that may exist there. We are also unafraid to look at what we traditionally think of as different types of phenomena, such as cryptids, UFOs, etc., and take a look at how and why they may cross over and be part of a greater whole. Zelia Edgar, welcome back as co-host to the High Strangeness Factor.
Well, hey, Steve, thank you so much for having me back on the show. It is always a pleasure to be here, and I am very excited about our guest today. So,
well, so am I. And but first, I want to remind people that they can go back in the archives because I can't even remember how many times that I have interviewed you, but it's always been fun. And the people that hear us together, a good friend of ours from Van Meter, Brandy, just gets a kick out of it all the time. And because we kind of get off and running. And sometimes I think we may actually forget to explain things because we're so on the same wavelength. We kind of expect people to kind of keep up with us. But also, there were several shows where you have been on as co-host, and also your mom, Lori Bass, has been on too, and I think those shows are worth going back and checking out. But very, very quickly, let's talk about what you have to offer. You have had a YouTube channel up for how long has it been up now?
Oh gosh, I think I started in either 2016 or 2017. I'm terrible remembering these dates, unfortunately.
But it's before we met at Van Meter, right?
Oh yeah, it was a couple of years before that. And of course we met in 2019 at the Van Meter Visitor Festival. So yeah, it's been a while now. And yeah, I just, totally love it. I started it kind of on a lark. I've been, interested in all of this manner of weird and unexplained stuff for as long as I can remember. And eventually I was like, you know what, I want to do something with this. So I started my YouTube channel, Just Another Tinfoil Hat. And, I have to say the response I've gotten I'm very appreciative of it. Being able to connect with so many people interested in the same things as I am has been absolutely amazing. So
you've got shows on there. You've got great YouTube pieces where people that listen to your YouTube channel are probably not going to hear another static Roswell report. Well, yeah, there was the crash saucer, and they found the bendy metal, and they carted the aliens off to Trenton, New Jersey, or something. But your stuff is always interesting, and you have come up with a few things that I didn't know about, and you always have an interesting angle, and the way you put the patterns and parallels together is always fascinating. But you have book reviews, you have a backlog of shows, and what else are you doing now? There's besides book reviews?
I just started up, so now I'm kind of on a schedule where every other week I do kind of one of my conventional videos where I take either a concept or a certain, case of some sort of weird entity encounter and I kind of dissect it. And then once a month I do a paranormal book review. And I just started that up, I want to say maybe a couple months ago. And then once a month as well, so the opposite, biweekly schedule there. I've been doing horror movie reviews, kind of bringing in another sort of tangential interest of mine, because I absolutely love horror movies, creature features, sci-fi, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's kind of the new schedule.
We found out that we also have interest in things like Twin Peaks and H.P. Lovecraft. So we actually talk about more things than just John Keel.
Yes, sometimes. I mean, the Keel part does take up most of it, but there is some other stuff out there.
Okay, well, let's introduce our guest. Prior to pursuing his dream of becoming a full-time author and musician in 2015, Joshua Cutchin served as Public Affairs Director of the University of Georgia Hugh Hodgson School of Music for 3 years. During his tenure at UGA, Joshua authored over 100 articles, press releases, and blog posts. In addition to appearing in local media, his press releases have also been referenced and distributed by such media outlets as the Associated Press and National Public Radio. Joshua has appeared on a wide variety of paranormal programs discussing his work, including Coast to Coast AM, Mysterious Universe, Binnall of America, Radio Misterioso, and the Gralien Project. He is the author of 5 books: A Trojan Feast, The Brimstone Deceit, Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions, and in the 2020s, Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, volumes 1 and 2 with Timothy Renner. 2021 will see the release of Fairies on Film, a collection of essays which he is the editor and a contributor. Joshua's writing is also featured in Robbie Graham's 2017 collection of ufological essays, UFOs, Reframing the Debate, as well as David Weatherly's Woodknocks Volume 3, 2018, and Peach State Monsters, 2021. Excerpts of his work have appeared in Fortean Times and Edge Science. Joshua has been featured on the History Channel television show Ancient Aliens and is a recurring roundtable guest on Where Did the Road Go podcast. Joshua, welcome to the High Strangeness Factor.
It's great to be here. We were just chatting. We were just chatting in the Mutual Admiration Society before we started. I think we're all happy to be here.
Yes. I guess the place to start is how did you get started? How does your interest evolve? I know I'm not an experiencer. I've had one strange experience in my entire paranormal career. So I was pulled in by the books of Frank Edwards, and then in Michigan we had I'm old enough to remember the swamp gas sightings when Dr. Hynek showed up in March of '66 and pronounced some of the sightings swamp gas. And then a few months later, the Mothman showed up in the November of that year. So that's kind of what got me started. But how did your interest develop in all of this?
Well, I, unlike a lot of people in this field, was not an experiencer. You can really fit a lot of my stuff inside a thimble in terms of paranormal encounters. But I was a big creature feature kid. Like, I loved monster movies, and I think the first movie that I ever saw was the 1933 King Kong. And I was fascinated with the dinosaurs, and from then it was all about creature features, especially those great creature features of the late 70s and 80s. And of course, I always had on the side, I think comes with that, an interest in Forteana. Bigfoot was my thing for the longest time. But then in 2012, I got a job that had an hour commute, both there and back, and started, listening to some paranormal podcasts. The books that I had were primarily just generalized weirdness, and then with a little bit of Bigfoot here and there. I didn't have the massive UFO library that I do now. And I just got more and more interested in the topic. For the longest time, I was skeptical of the entire UFO phenomena because I was skeptical of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And then once I learned that there were other options out there, the whole thing became a little bit more palatable for me. So I sort of just ended up getting more and more interested in it. And, at the same time that this was happening, I had a sister-in-law who gave me an Amazon gift card that I used to get J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch. And I'll never forget, there's a portion in there that says that if you take food from the Bukwas, one of the indigenous Sasquatch analogs up there in Alaska, you'll be trapped with the Bukwas forever. I'm like, that sounds a lot like Celtic fairy food. And I'm like, somebody should write a book on that. And I've sat around and, Nick Redfern didn't do it. Sat around for a couple of months and I'm like, okay, is it me? So I actually, that summer I was working at the University of Georgia in the School of Music department. And that summer, summers tend to get a little bit calmer at universities if you're working a staff job. So I sort of used that summer to write A Trojan Feast. And, after that, I was joking with somebody else. It's kind of like you get the Scarlet W branded on you, the weirdo. Because, once you get that, it's a stink you can't wash off. So I was like, well, my name's out there with this attached to it. at the time I was looking to move from my university job to maybe another position, but I'm pretty sure that some of the job application processes that I got through I got pretty high. I got shortlisted. I'm sure they finally said, "Oh, let's Google this guy," and then they saw that a Trojan feast my name was attached to this weird stuff. So I'm convinced that there's a couple of positions out there that I didn't get because of this. But that's neither here nor there. I said, you know what? I'm gonna not work at this desk job anymore, and I'm just going to teach private lessons and gig and write books. And that's sort of been my trajectory since about 2015, which feels a lot longer ago than 6 years, but I guess it was just 6 years ago.
Well, I there was one time I think I I kind of chewed you out a little bit on Facebook Messenger, or maybe it was just on Facebook, where I blamed you for having to buy dozens and dozens of books I would not have purchased because of the way you design your books with at least 1.5 million footnotes. And you go back and you see this wonderful virtual library of books. Some I have, but so many are pretty obscure. And then you you try to find them and find out some you can afford, some are on Kindle, and some have gone to third-party pirates that you can't afford.
Yeah.
But it's so great to have. I just can't tell you. I should have put a separate wing in of my library of books that Joshua Cutchin made me buy.
Well, it's one of those things where I was fortunate enough to live at the time just an hour from the University of Georgia. Now it's, I don't know, about an hour and 45 minutes. But pre-COVID, it was very common for me to go out to the library, and I think as an alumni, you could still get stuff through interlibrary loan, and that was a huge component in some of that early research that I was doing. But the other thing is that you find. I really think that we should treat paranormal topics as a culture a lot more akin to like wind and sunlight and just like these epiphenomena of just being, existing on Earth. And you find paranormal things in some places that you would think to find them. There's one example that I always like to use is that there's a memoir of a gentleman who fled a prison camp. Not going to get the details of what conflict, but he fled a prison camp and he was traveling through Tibet. And there's like 3 paragraphs in it, maybe a couple pages. Very straightforward memoir, but there's like 3 or 4 pages in it that are about him running into these 2 Yeti, and it's a very matter-of-fact thing. And then he goes on, and the rest of the story is his continuing memoir about like making his way over this arduous trek over the mountains. And I find stuff like that fascinating. And I also, I've kind of gotten to the point where if someone presents to me a video on UFO disclosure or a video on Indo-European horse sacrifice, I'm probably going to watch the video on Indo-European horse sacrifice, because with where my headspace is at, that actually has a lot more to do with UFOs than the video on UFO disclosure. Because you do find all these sort of symbolic and thematic tangents that sort of branch out from these topics once you dive in.
Yeah, it's just it's massive once you get into it, and all the I'm trying to put together some kind of a coherent talk for my Bigfoot talk coming up at the Wyndham Arms in Ann Arbor. By the time this airs, I think it'll still. I don't think this will air after it, but nevertheless, there's just there's so much. And I mean, I even want to put kind of a parallel in there, talk a little bit about the Loch Ness Monster, because I don't know if you're familiar with Ted Holliday and his journey, where he first thought it was some kind of an oversized mollusk. And then as he went on, he found out that there's something really, really strange about this, and decided that it was some kind of a psychic projection, perhaps. And all the things that happened around it, Men in Black and the whole thing. But there's just there's so much. And I'm wondering, when you're writing, I almost would love to be able to see the writing process, because you and like Tim Renner in the Bigfoot books, you guys cover so much. It's phenomenal. And how the heck do you keep track of all of it and put it all together?
To two different. I'm going to address the Loch Ness monster thing, and then I'll get to the keeping
Okay.
track of it part. Yeah, I did not have any of Holiday's work until just for this recent project. I finally broke down and was able to actually get a pretty cheap copy of The Dragon and the Disc.
Oh, yes.
And it's good. Along with it, I also bought Michel Megier's, if I'm not pronouncing that name right or not, Lake Monster Traditions, which is another out of print book, and that one has really actually been of the three that and the Great Orm of Loch Ness and Dragon the Disc has been the one that's really kind of blown my mind open. But yeah, I really respect people like Holiday in the sense that when you see people's beliefs evolve, that's always really encouraging to me.
Yes.
There's another podcaster that we cite regularly in Where the Footprints End, Timothy and I, by the name of Wes Germer, who has a show called Sasquatch Chronicles, and he has had a very intellectually honest journey from literally like having entire segments making fun of people who talk about the supernatural nature of Sasquatch to actually flipping to the other direction and being like, yeah, these things are weird and it disturbs me because I don't want them to be weird, but I've heard enough stuff, I've experienced enough stuff that yes, there is some sort of strange, supernatural component to Bigfoot besides just being a big monkey. People like that I really respect. I think of the way that Peter Robbins sort of pivoted once he found out that aspects of the Rendlesham case were not airtight. People who have
Right.
really built a lot of their work on these big cases. Whenever you can do that, yeah, you get my undying appreciation and support to be sort of intellectually honest like that. Now, as far as the as far as the keeping track of things, I didn't used to do this until people kept on saying, like, you have so many different sources. How do you keep this all straight? And now, as I'm writing, I'm like, man, I have a lot of sources. How do I keep this all straight? It's almost like when somebody's really talented at some sort of trick, and then they start to overthink it. And I kind of wonder if I'm doing that a little bit right now. I don't know. I will say that the trade-off for that is that I kind of sometimes forget personal stories that happen in my life that aren't related to any of this stuff. So I think that I'm using up a certain section of my mental hard drive that could maybe be used for more personal things. But yeah, I do end up seeing this. I don't think it's a full-blown memory palace, but I do end up seeing things as this interconnected web of associations, and that sort of helps guide me through it. But it does get pretty hairy sometimes. The project I'm working on right now is going to be absolutely way too big. It has it, but because of that, it has an outline that I put together over the course of 6 months, just working, at my desk 8 hours a day. Well, not 8 hours a day because I have toddlers, but 6 hours, 6 hours a day, really, cranking through and just going through all my books one by one and finding any references that were germane to the topic at hand. So there's
So,
a lot of planning involved.
so this is the book that I heard you more than hint about on Facebook one time. The next book that's in process. So, can we assume that it has at least partially to do with the Loch Ness monster or water monsters?
Oh yeah, I mean
Okay.
it's so what happened is it started off. So okay, so I should preface this in case people are expecting this to come out really soon. I do have another collection that's coming out soon. I'm editor and contributor to a collection of Aries essays on fairies, um, essays on fairies in cinema that should be coming out
Okay.
like literally this month or next month. So that's not the next thing, but after that is what I'm working on currently because that's sort of been shepherded off into the production stages. Yeah, it started off as wanting to explore that famous Anne Strieber quote, Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death. And I should have looked at it a little bit more narrowly because you end up talking about death and you end up talking about reincarnation beliefs and afterlife beliefs and near-death experiences. And then, of course, I've got to talk about fairies and aliens. And, oh, wait, here comes shamanic initiation. And here are monument sites across the Americas and across Europe. It really does sort of metastasize into all these sort of different areas. But there is a portion that I'll be getting to at some point towards the end of the book where I do talk about lake monsters and how a lot of those are associated with death and some of the symbolism that you can find there, and not just death omens, but things like how a lot of times not only skeptics will say that lake monsters are just logs, but sometimes logs symbolically in certain traditions are representations of lake monsters, or lake monsters can turn into logs or something. And if you look at that from a Jungian perspective, the log is a coffin, it's a casket. There's a real strong association between sort of trees and death. So it's gotten way too big, but it's turned into my sort of theory of everything as I see it right now. So I'm sure that I'll sell 3 copies, and those people will love it, and everybody else will hate it. But
well,
it's
Zelia
not
and I will
everybody's
be buying 2 of them, so there's
Yeah.
one left for somebody else.
Well, I mean, and I think that's kind of, I mean, sometimes that's sort of a guiding ethos I try to stick to as well. It's like, I'm not, if you're doing this, if you're in these fields for money, it's a fool's errand, right? I mean, if you're lucky, you can, pay for some home improvements or something, some minor home improvements. But I'm really doing it for me, and it's a book for me and for people who are sympathetic to the way that I think. And if they aren't, well, sorry, I'm not here to tell you something that doesn't jive with what I don't think.
Well, your books are as valuable as I hold Keel's writings and Jacques Vallée's writings. So I don't know what esteem you hold Keel and Vallée, but I hold them in very high esteem. So yeah, these are monumental works.
I do as well, and I am extremely flattered. Even though I think your praise is misplaced in that regard, I'll still take it and say that I'm extremely flattered. Thank you.
But a few things. I've been taking some notes here. You mentioned the Strebers. Well, they wrote a fascinating book called The Communion Letters, and these were a segment of the letters of thousands of letters they got from people that talked about abduction experiences, and some of those deal with death. I mean, it's just bizarre. And some of the experiences that people report, I highly recommend you get this. If people get this book, you can get it on Kindle, I think, if not a hard copy. But if you think ET is the only explanation for UFOs, you won't after you read this. Also, Ted Holliday's next book was called The Goblin Universe. I don't know if you've been able to get a hold of a copy of that.
Yeah, that and the communion letters are both really informative in this regard. And that's sort of my go-to whenever people are like, "Oh, you don't think UFOs are aliens?" I'm like, "Okay, well, they might be, but we still, if you want to associate alien abductions with UFOs, and I think it's reasonable to a certain degree to do that, you have to account for profound synchronicities in experiencers' lives. You have to account for poltergeist effects afterward. You have to account for, as we're alluding to right now, the appearance of dead loved ones in these encounters. And I'm sorry, if they're aliens, they're really, 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 really weird aliens. Like, they're like alien sorcerers, which, if you're gonna say that they're alien sorcerers, you might as well open up the whole thing and say, we don't really know what these things are. Right. The nuts and bolts crowd will say, oh, they're screen memories of dead relatives and loved ones. And okay, I can maybe kind of buy that to a certain degree, but again, you have these after effects that are happening in "quote unquote" our reality as well, that are just really inexplicable. And I think that's what I find most fascinating about the UFO topic.
When in one of Zelia's fairly recent YouTube videos had to do with the Cisco Grove encounter, where this bow hunter is out there, and to make a long story short, he sees the big craft, it's some kind of a pod. Scout craft or something lands, and these 2 strange guys, they look a little bit like Greys, I guess, but they come up to the tree and they're trying to climb the tree, but they're not successful. So they send out this little robot-like thing that opens its mouth and sends out this noxious gas where the guy starts to pass out. So he ties himself to the tree branch. I mean, what the hell is that? I mean,
he's throwing like loose change at it.
Yeah. and lighting parts of his clothing to keep them away, because they've got this craft from Alpha Centauri, but they don't have a tractor beam. They don't even have some kind of net they can throw down and grab him. Instead, they're trying to just get him out of the tree. I think, but the people that reported this seem credible. And also one of Zelia's favorite, well, mine too, is the case of the cosmic pancakes. And Zelia, you want to talk about that a little bit, about how absurd that whole thing is?
Well, I am always up for talking about the Simonton encounter. And I have to say, like, that for me is one of those cases that it's probably my absolute favorite case of, quote unquote UFO occupant contact. So, of course, Eagle River, Wisconsin in April of 1961, a man by the name of Joe Simonton heard this strange noise outside. He was eating breakfast around 11 o'clock in the morning. He said that he heard this weird noise like knobby tires on wet pavement, looked outside, saw a classic flying saucer. Inside of it were some entities which he claimed looked like short Italian men wearing little knit caps and turtleneck suits. And somehow he got the vibe that they needed water. And so, in true Wisconsinite fashion, I must say, he was like, yeah, okay, I'll just get the spacemen some water. And when he returned with it, he was given in exchange some pancakes. And I have to say, Josh, the first book of yours that I read was A Trojan Feast. And I know that you discussed Simonton in there to a really, really great length. And I just genuinely, that was just so thrilling for me. I got the same vibe when I read Passport to Magonia, and Valet spent so much time on it because this case is evident, like Cisco Grove, of just almost kind of like coded nonsense is what it seems to be at first. And then once you take a look, it ties into all of these very symbolic traditions, which seem to be a massive part of culture. So yeah, I just seriously, your work is fantastic. And when I first read, A Trojan Feast, I was absolutely blown away. So
well, first of all, thank you. And second of all, yeah, it's a favorite of mine too, because you're right. It does have all these sort of fey folk hallmarks about it. Although, I think what people who want to be, resistant to those comparisons, they'll say, okay, well, you're saying that aliens are fairies, and it's like, well, no, it's not. It's not quite what I'm saying. I'm saying that that there seems to be something that changes a lot of its surface details with our own expectations, but sort of has some remaining core elements that are very, very similar or speak to us on like these on these deeper symbolic or even like maybe even like sort of racial memory areas. I kind of wondered if I was positioned like you, Zelia, in the great state of Wisconsin, as I once was, I kind of would be inclined to track down, see if there are any relatives of his, and see if there are, if this was a family story, if they disavowed it, and then sort of, I could have probably done this myself at some point to really see what his heritage was, because some of the links that I made with certain fairy traditions pointed to certain areas of Europe, and it'll be really interesting to see if actually no, his family, some members of his family did come from these specific regions, and that's why this phenomena chose to speak to him in this sort of way, as in trying to keep some sort of sense of continuity with his heritage. I don't know. The importance of heritage in these encounters is something that has been much debated, but Eagle River is not the kind of place where you can land a UFO and give out pancakes anymore.
Yeah, it has so many threads. I mean, the swarthy Italians. They looked like kind of like the, in quotes, dark foreign types that Keel kept getting reports of landing in flying saucers. The way they gathered the water. There's another incident out in California in the mid-50s where this little guy gathered water in a bucket. It's just mind blowing. And again, it's got that absurd factor. One other thing, when you mentioned lake monsters and death and so forth. Have you come across, well, I guess we would have, Dr. Donald Ullman, the guy that went with Holiday to exercise?
Yeah.
Yes. And anyway, I've been pursuing him. He wrote a book about being an exorcist. And that's where Holiday first found out about him, because he made a comment in there that Loch Ness might not be a physical creature. And he also, according to his book, he has encountered other lake monsters in another part of Scotland. And then he encountered one in a fjord in Norway, the Troll Fjord, I think it was called. And the captain there told him that they were evil, and he knew they were evil. They won't attack you, but they somehow leave some kind of residue behind or whatever. Anyway, it's really fascinating to pursue Dr. Donald Ullman. There's even a book I have that I haven't read yet about him exercising the Bermuda Triangle. So I think maybe Loch Ness is small change, and he was working up to the big time. But I guess what I'm curious as to Now, when I was, I went along very happily for a while in the 60s, reading, Jim and Cora Lorenzen's books about landings and little guys in silver suits, and was very happy with the ET idea. And then I went kicking and screaming when I first read Operation Trojan Horse by John Keel, where he pulls all these things together. And I'd like to tell people that I barely recovered from that one, and I read Passport to Magonia, and then there was no turning back. So what was it? Did you have? You said early on you were skeptical that UFOs were ET. So was there a moment where you were kind of seduced to the dark side, where you went over to the high strangeness, or was it a gradual?
Well, that was my thing, was that, Bigfoot is real because we have all this great physical evidence and dermal ridges and mid-tarsal breaks and all that. But UFOs are kind of bunk because there are all these various types of craft, and you're telling me that there are, 30 different races that are visiting Earth, because, it kind of looks like that when you look at the humanoid reports. I think 30 is kind of a conservative number. So I was kind of poo-pooing the whole UFO thing, and I think the moment... Okay, well, let me preface this. I was poo-pooing the whole UFO thing while also being terrified of the idea of alien abductions, like to an unhealthy degree for a grown-ass man, right? Being in my 20s and being, everybody can talk about how it'd be cool to see an alien in the daytime, but when it's 3 a.m. and you wake up and you see shadows in the room and you start thinking about communion, like the character of it changes a bit. Now, of course, there are people in the UFO community who would say that this is indicative that I am a contactee or an abductee or something. I don't think that's the case because, honestly, Steve, Zelia, I would be terrified if I saw you in my room at 3 a.m.
Well, if I found myself there, I wonder, how the hell did I get here? I mean, I can call him on Skype.
I think we would all be terrified. So I was sort of skeptical of the UFO and abduction phenomena, while at the same time being scared of it. And then I started hearing about the similarities between, I think the sort of breaking point that you referenced was when I started hearing about the similarities of UFO encounters and altered state reports, specifically, psychedelic state reports or entheogen reports. And that to me indicated that, well, there's, number one, there's a comparative consistency to these things, which I think is where the strength of the paranormal really lies, is in the comparison between things. It's not any one case that I would be willing to bet the farm on, but if I can see a bunch of cases that illustrate a trend of people who across time or space or cultures or continents are citing this one really strange consistency, then that's when I'm like, okay, there's something to this, right? Even if it's just a Jungian collective unconscious sort of a mechanism at play. So I saw these consistencies in these, basically trip reports, and then in the UFO thing, and I said, okay, it seems to have something to do with consciousness. And to sort of cure me of my terrified alien abduction phobia, if this has something to do with consciousness, that means I have some sort of sovereignty, some sort of foot in the door to defend myself, right? So I think that's sort of where it all came out. I mean, it was a full blown phobia. I think my dad showed me Close Encounters of the Third Kind way too early as a kid, and it was a point where like I couldn't even look at an illustration of a gray alien. Like, it was that bad. And then now I write and talk and look at the stuff all the time and don't feel a thing. So I think that's probably where it was, just sort of exercising that degree of personal defense in case I would ever run into a situation like that, which, knock on wood, I haven't. I've seen some ghosts, maybe been huffed at by a Bigfoot, but
wow.
No UFO contact. So
yeah, I actually might have had missing time. Oh, this brings up another thing. I think it was you. I think it was somewhere that you talked about an experience you had and didn't really process it at the time. In other words, what I'm talking about is sometimes people they'll see a Bigfoot, they'll see a craft, they got the camera hanging around their neck, or maybe they don't have a camera, but they see something and they just don't process it. It's like, oh, yeah, it's a Bigfoot. And they go about their work, or somebody sees a UFO in the sky, and doesn't stop to observe it, but they think, well, I'll be late if I get to work, and that's kind of what happened to me one night in the TNT area. Did you relate an experience like that where you kind of uh, had something strange happen but didn't process it or focus on it properly? I might have,
There,
maybe it was somebody else.
no, I think I remember speaking about this, and I think it was about something else that might have been so mundane that it slipped right back down into in the back of my mind again. But I will say that I did see this boy in in Confederate gray at Stonewall Jackson's house,
Wow.
which
Yeah.
was used as a hospital, and I saw him, and I thought he was a cosplayer. And it wasn't until a little bit later, in the moment, I didn't realize it was strange. It wasn't until a little bit later that I was able to confirm with everybody else on my tour and the the people who were selling tickets, who were functioning as gatekeepers for the property, that nobody had come through looking like that, and there were no reenactors or anything that day. So that might have been something that I was referring to. But I mean, yeah, you hear that. That's the frustrating thing. I was sitting on a panel at a conference in North Carolina earlier this month, and somebody was like, "Well, why don't we have photographs?" And it's like, if you're really into this stuff, you kind of have found a way to come to peace with why people don't have photographs. And there are I think there are plenty of different answers. Not only like being so astonished or frightened that you forget, but also there's the almost meta narrative element at play, right? Like, these things seem to have control over, not over whether you want to take a photograph, but they seem to exercise control over the equipment, over the ability to, to appear in focus or not. I mean, there's so many different things. To say no, to say,
Batteries.
yeah, the batteries. I mean, to say nothing of the fact that, like, what you're trying to take a photo of might not be what you're seeing. What you're seeing might be like what your consciousness sees, but to an
Right.
objective piece of equipment that just looks like a smudge, I don't know, 1,000 different reasons. But yeah, that's a super common thing where people seem to have this sense of really not being themselves fall over them. And I suppose that might have been what I'm referring to, or again, it might have been something that, because I feel like I've had this conversation with my wife about, like, she said to me, like, that was weird, right? And I'm like, was it weird? I don't remember. So I feel like I've had this conversation recently, and it's faded from memory again.
Well, I just remember being having a situation where I had something. I walked into my motel room and the TV set turned on by itself and started flipping through channels, and I thought, okay, and I unplugged the TV and went to bed. And I was really beating myself up because a couple other strange things happened. I didn't take notes. I didn't focus on anything, and then I started reading accounts of people that have had the same thing happen. So I didn't feel quite so bad. But when you talk about the Loch Ness monster, the Holiday would get his camera up and ready to
Hmm.
go. It would sink beneath the surface, or a camera would jam, or cameras that are battery operated would die. And then there was another instance where they had two cameras out on one side of the lock, which crossed each other, and there was a whole dead spot in between. And of course, one time Nessie was just steaming back and forth in the area where the cameras wouldn't catch her, and that was it. So there's really something very bizarre about that. I wanted to go back just a little bit, and Zelia, I don't remember what was your moment when you were essentially seduced to the dark side, because you started out. I think you started out looking at things as pretty nuts and bolts and flesh and blood.
Mhm.
Am I correct on that?
Oh yeah, well, I've had, like I said, I've been interested in this since before I can remember pretty much. And when I started getting really into the actual research was when I was, gosh, probably like maybe 8 years old about. Before that I had read all of my grandma's, like, they had the Reader's Digest compendiums of, like,
Oh
mysteries of
yeah.
the world and stuff like that. I had read up on all of those. She had some ghost books. And when I hit age 8-ish, I was just like really into cryptozoology. That was my thing. And so for many years, that was kind of my main focus. And I definitely at that time, as a kid, I wanted to find Bigfoot. That was like the end all be it for me. And then as time went on, I also started garnering an interest for, spectrology and ufology as well, but remaining separate. And again, proof was like, that was kind of my life goal, was finding that, undeniable proof that would make the entire world see, hey, this stuff is real. And then in my late teens, I actually first watched the Mothman Prophecies movie, and I thought to myself, I was like, oh, well, this is definitely way dramatized, because I remembered reading about the Mothman in cryptid books, and they claimed it was just some sort of weird cryptid. And oh, also, by the way, at the time, this bridge fell. And so that's when I read the Mothman Prophecies, because I was like, well, I want to get the real story here. And surprisingly enough, that's not what did it for me. It was finally when I read Operation Trojan Horse that I was like, okay, there are definite undeniable similarities here between each apparently different type of unexplained phenomena. It may be helped too by the fact that I had read The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings probably when I was about 9, not realizing who the heck John Keel even was. I thought it was just a really cool book on cryptids. So part of me wonders if that kind of primed my subconscious for, accepting it, because once I hit that understanding, there was just totally no looking back.
Uh, go ahead, Joshua.
I was just going to say, I mean, yeah, of course you started as a nuts and bolts person because we're not crazy people. And I'm not saying that, obviously, I'm not saying that believing in the supernatural aspects of these things makes people crazy, but I'm saying, like, what I am saying is that people don't just default to woo. Like, they have to be touched by it, they have to find it. Everybody approaches these topics from a rational perspective, and then you end up at this impasse where you have people who are very sane, people who you talk to. I mean, we've all talked to them at conferences and such. We've talked to people who seem to have some issues, right? But we've also talked to people who seem very stable and very sane and have tried to talk themselves out of what they saw. And they say, you know what? At the end of the day, I saw a little man step out of a globe of light. And you're like, I don't know what to do with that. And you reach this impasse where you've got all this stuff that sounds like fantasy and all this testimony and some physical evidence that seems to suggest reality. And you're like, okay, I guess we're in this middle imaginal realm where reality is reality and unreal, is physical and non-physical, are false dichotomies.
Yeah. Well, I think too, the interesting thing is that what eventually hit me is that trying to rationalize away the weird stuff, if you're being honest to the material and honest to yourself, there comes a point where you just can't do that anymore. You're excluding evidence instead of including it, which for a field that's already relegated to the fringes of our society, I mean, it's a major bummer, to literally pull, as Charles Fort would say, to damn the evidence.
100%. Yes. Yes. I could not have put it better myself. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Tom Powell, who I guess was also one that started out thinking that Bigfoot was simply an undocumented creature. He just through experiences and people he talked to found that there just are a very high strangeness aspects that go with this phenomena. And he wrote that people he talked to, some of them were so relieved to find out that other people had high strangeness aspects with their Bigfoot sighting. I mean, they just breathed a sigh of relief, like, well, either, well, we're not crazy or we're crazy with a bunch of other people. And that's
Right.
That's kind of the way it goes, because, it's strange enough to talk about a hairy biped in the woods, but to talk about it turning into an orb or seeing it in conjunction with strange lights, that's way out there. I wondered, have you encountered the book Valley of the Skookum by Sally Shepherd Wolford?
I'm going to say no, actually.
Okay, well, that's one you may want to pursue, because it's another classic case of the kind of stuff you and Tim have been writing about. It's she is the mother of Autumn Williams, and
okay.
Yep, and she chronicles the stuff that happened when Autumn was between 3 and 6 years old in Ording, Washington, and right near the Carbon River. And they lived in a little cabin. They had poltergeist phenomena occur there. They saw apparently flesh and blood Bigfoots. There were classic UFO sightings. They had visits by men in black. They could hear machinery. Now they're out in the middle of nowhere. They could hear machinery like something out of a factory, feel the heat and smells of like a factory, which I think you guys have chronicled in some of your books. It was just, and also there were orange orbs that would chase cars. I mean, it has a little bit of everything. And I got a chance to hear her interviewed on Dave Schrader's old show, Darkness Radio, and it was really way back in 2006. So that's another great resource if you ever want to do Volume 3 of Where the Footsteps End. But
No,
yeah,
that sounds awesome. I really hate that we didn't stumble across that one. Yeah, it's so interesting to me because there's this tendency in the Bigfoot community, especially, to say, the little bit of ground that they'll cede is they'll say, well, okay, well, Bigfoot's weird east of the Mississippi, but west of the Mississippi, it's all, pretty natural.
Right.
And that's just not the case. Judging from 1,000 things, including, the book that you just referenced to, which I assume takes place in Washington or Oregon.
Yes, right. Well, and also she talks about how they would hear the sort of the rapid fire Chinese chatter, for lack of a better description. And this is right about the same time that Ron Moorhead is capturing these things on tape in the Sierra Nevadas. So it's very interesting to hear her description paralleling with his description in a different part of the Northwest. Yeah, you'll love the book. It's really fascinating. Let's see. Let me do my station identification here, and we'll get right back to it. You are listening to the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I am Steve Ward. My co-host today is Zelia Edgar, and we are talking to Joshua Cutchin. And just briefly, Joshua, you are a musician, correct?
I try to be.
Yeah, well, that's close enough.
Last year wasn't so much of a musician. That's for sure.
Oh, okay.
There wasn't a lot of music last year. I played tuba, and primarily jazz tuba.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how long have you been doing that?
Since I was in 7th grade, and I'm 36 now. So what is that? 20 some odd years? No, more than. Oh God, I'm old. Yeah,
you're,
a long time.
You're old.
Long time. 25 years maybe.
Well, I'm old enough that our friend Chad Lewis has a never-ending stream of old guy jokes. So the only thing I hope is I get to be really old, so that when Chad is old, I can pay him back. But
Nice.
that'll be a while. Let's see. Boy, there's just so much to cover. I hope you'll come back, be a regular guest, because there's just it's just a vast area. Zelia, when we were both talking about Where the Footsteps End, Volume 1 and 2, by Joshua Cutchin and Timothy Renner, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Is that you got his name right? Okay. There were certain things that you kind of keyed on, certain things that really impressed you, the some of the connections and so forth they were making. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of that?
Well, I would love to point out real quick, I was so thrilled, and you even had this a little bit in A Trojan Feast, when you tied Bigfoot to fairy lore. When I first saw that in A Trojan Feast, and then when it was, definitely continued, I would say, in Where the Footprints End, and even bringing in some of like the more, like witchcraft or occult related, connections there, I was just absolutely blown away, because if you can take two ends of the spectrum, Bigfoot is like, like you were just saying, Bigfoot is kind of its own thing. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is quite a bit of physical evidence for it. And I do believe that, in our current culture, we definitely look at things as it's either this or that. It can't possibly be something that may be both, or maybe there's a few different options. So I would just, I guess what exactly really started tying in some of, you mentioned earlier how there are certain traditions with different types of Sasquatch or Bigfoot, legends that tie so closely to fairy lore. So, that was just, I guess, fantastic.
Well, I think that where I've sort of landed, and people are welcome to take this and twist it the wrong way into me working backwards from a premise, but I think that where I've landed is that everything isn't fairies, but fairy lore is a very consistent sort of system of beliefs that tends to explain a lot of these things. So in other words, I don't think that aliens are aliens and fairies are fairies, and I don't think that Bigfoot is Bigfoot. I don't think that they're all fairies, and I don't think that they're all aliens, or they're all cryptids or something. I think that these things are describing similar phenomena, and if I had to really have my feet held to the fire, I would kind of edge towards the notion that the closest holistic model is fairy lore, because there is just such a consistency from continent to continent, from culture to culture, not just Northwestern Europe, which is what we normally focus on, but really the whole world in general. So you know, if it's also the transitive property, right? So the alien fairy thing is so blurred in my mind that I can't differentiate the two. Like Phalians is where I am now. It's
Well,
like
that's good.
the same phenomena, really. And but using that sort of transitive property, so fairies are connected very closely to the dead, so that means that aliens might be connected to the dead, but also you have Bigfoot connected to a lot of these UFO sightings. So does that mean that so it's sort of A to B to C to D sort of logic, I think, is what sort of pushed me in that direction. And that coupled with some of these little details that hinted that it would be a rewarding avenue to investigate, especially like the braiding of horses' manes, right? Like that's something that you find time and again in fairy lore and also witch lore in Europe. And once I heard that Bigfoot did that, I'm like, okay. Generally, when there's that sort of smoke, there's some sort of fairy fire.
Yes.
So you see one or two aspects that are really specific and really odd, and you're like, okay, I'm sure that if I investigate this more, I will find other rewarding similarities there. So I think that's probably where it came from. To say nothing of the fact that you've got these European wildman traditions, which sound very much like fairies. I mean, I didn't get to include it in my prior book, Thieves in the Night, but there are some wildman traditions where, like, basically Bigfoot comes along and leaves behind a changeling, like a Bigfoot changeling. I really hate I didn't put that together for the book for Thieves in the Night, but there's a slight mention of it in the in volume 1 of Where the Footprints End, and yeah, so just little things like that tend to say, okay, well, these can kind of be viewed on a continuum or a spectrum of sorts, I think.
I like that when you said and it's true when I think about it, that fairy lore seems to underlie everything. And I started thinking about you've heard, of course, the stories of the Skinwalker Ranch from the book, The Hunt for the Skinwalker. They had the incident where the bulls were displaced. They were out of their pen and they were all crammed in this white trailer somehow in kind of a stupor. Then if you go, here's another book that maybe you have or haven't encountered, called The Dubbed Enigma. Dubbed is spelled Dyfed, by Ted Holliday and Randall Pugh, and it deals with a bizarre set of landings and UFO phenomena, very connected to fairy lore in Wales in '77. And there was an incident there where the cattle kept getting displaced a half-mile away to another farm. Even one time when the guy put 16 cows in a pen, went to his barn to turn the milk machines on, came back, and they're gone. And here they are a half-mile away at the Broadmoor farm. And then lastly, there was I interviewed Alan Godfrey, who's a classic alien abductee, from Todmorden, England. And he has the kind of the classic UFO case, although he has the tall, regal figure along with the grays that he can't even look at. But this tall, regal figure dressed in white, sort of like the tall fairy queen motif or whatever. But and he has the whole ordeal started with displaced cows, people reporting cows behind this gated fence in an area where they shouldn't be. So, and of course, the weird aspect of that is he's under hypnosis talking about what he's seeing inside this craft, and he sees a black dog in there. And he says it's hideous. He says it's about the size of a German Shepherd, making one think of the lore of the black shuck, the black spectral dog that haunts the moors and castles in England. So again, you're getting folklore and fairy lore in there. So anyway, back to the Dubbed Enigma, Pugh and Holliday, while they're not definitive or not trying to say this is what it is, they found a tradition in Norwegian folklore where the milkmaid kept the cow she put in her pen to milk kept disappearing and getting out of the cage, and eventually one of the little people came to her and said, "You cannot put your cow there because it's destroying our food." And so they speculate, well, does that mean they're their food is derived from earth energy somehow, and they talk about ley lines, etc. And again, they weren't trying to say this was the explanation, but here you have this incident out of folklore where the cow is being moved. You have the Skinwalker Ranch, the bulls are being moved. On the Broadmoor Farm, the cattle are being moved. And again, you have that underlying theme of folklore, but how does it really fit? What can we really derive from that? I don't know.
Yeah, it again speaks to that underlying consistency, which sort of the headspace that I've tended to be in lately is that like it's almost that we live out semi-fictional narratives that come to life. And what I mean by that is that you can sort of view these consistencies between paranormal phenomena the same way you would as, entries in a folklore motif index, right? You might have a fairy tale from Bulgaria that has motifs, A, C, D, and Y, and then you'll have a unrelated story from Ireland that has A, X, Z, and Y, and Z. So sort of mixing and matching these different things. The only thing that I have to sort of guard myself against with my extensive love of fairy lore is that I don't get Faradolia. I don't end up seeing everything. It's good because there was a tendency to throw around that word in a way that we would similarly throw around paranormal. But I do think that some fairy lore in some part of the world has generally touched upon a lot of different paranormal topics. The dog thing with the Alan Godfrey instance is just fascinating to me right now because one of the most, not only the connections to Black Shuck and all these other things, but one of the most prominent psychopomps, these figures that lead people to and from the realm of the dead in cultures like literally everywhere, were dogs. So that's another connection there, perhaps. So yeah, it's just that's again why I sort of get squirmy when people ask me what I really think these things are and what's going on, because I in some sense I kind of don't care. It's the symbolic richness of these motifs and these variations and the way that it affects people that I think are kind of the real story that always gets buried when people are worried about big monkeys and
Right.
little green scientists. Yeah.
That's right. When you have the narrow focus on the physical, you lose all of this undercurrent, and it's just I guess we should talk a little bit about you call it the flesh and blood hypothesis versus what do you call the other hypothesis, the weird stuff?
Intellectual honesty. That's what.
Okay. No,
there we go.
That was a low blow. Sorry.
I'm going to send this to all the flesh and blood researchers. So, but you look at people like we mentioned Tom Powell, Moorhead, and Ron Moorhead, and several others that again, we all start out one way, trying to be logical and look at the reports, but then I remember I went to a Bigfoot conference at Salt Fork quite a few years ago now. This is when Don Keating was still doing them, and Ron Moorhead was speaking there, and his daughter got up, Rhonda, kind of spontaneously, and she talked about when she was out there with him a couple times she saw Bigfoot run by, and she talked about how she was getting what she felt like were telepathic communications one night, and I could just see the audience being dumbfounded because Ron at that point had not come out. He had not written his book called Quantum Bigfoot. He had written Voices in the Wilderness, and he had kept the stranger experiences close to the vest because he said Alan Berry, who was the journalist that went with them, and Alan Berry originally was a hard-nosed skeptic. He thought they were faking all this stuff when they went out there, but finally he realized they were not only faking it, but he saw some of the stranger aspects of this. So, but Rhonda talked about hearing these voices, and they were asking her, "Who is she? Who's that man you're with? What do you want here?" And she was answering them. One time they had an experience where she saw the Bigfoot just sprinting, going by, and she's trying to tell her dad, but it's gone. by the time he looks up. And it went to where her sister was. So they went over there and they asked her sister, "What did you see? Did you see something?" And she said, "Yes." She saw a wolf. She said a wolf came by, stopped, looked at her, and took off. Now, there aren't supposed to be any wolves there. Now, Rhonda wasn't saying that they weren't saying that this was a shape-shifting Bigfoot, but it is kind of fits that narrative, whether it shape-shifted or not. So, but here you had, and I got a chance to talk to her afterwards. This very, very credible lady, a normal people describing an extraordinary experience, which is what so much of this involves. So I guess what I'm leading up to is the flesh and blood researchers versus the ones that recognize. I'm being prejudiced here. That recognize that there are stranger aspects to all this. How do you process all that? How do you view that, Joshua?
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, okay, that's all right.
That's
Okay,
okay.
good. No, I'm glad it wasn't a technical difficulty. Good, good.
No.
Okay.
Give me 3 extra seconds to think. And my first thing I said was, "Who boy?" I think we no. No. This is. I'm trying to think of the best and most straightforward way to put this. I think that these communities, let's just focus on cryptozoology and let's just focus on Bigfootery, right?
All right.
I think the Bigfoot community does itself no service by saying and repeating things like, we haven't found a Bigfoot body because people don't find a lot of bear bodies. Well, people do find bear bodies.
They do.
I don't think they do anybody any good by saying, Bigfoot walks backwards through
Yes.
through whenever a trackway ends, Bigfoot tiptoes backwards through its tracks, right? Like you're actually in an attempt to sort of sit at the big boys table of materialist science. You're actually really undermining your own credibility because what you're saying is goofy. I'm sorry. So it's a weird space that people like Tim and I occupy, is that like we see and embrace a lot of these skeptical arguments because they're pretty logically airtight. I mean, yeah, I get that bodies decompose quicker than most city folk realize, but people do find things in the woods. People are able to shoot bears and they go down. They don't just turn around and walk away or not even pay attention when shot at close range with a high-powered rifle. Like
or disappear in a flash of light.
Right. So I think that that it's this impulse, to sit at the big kids table in the lunchroom, and I think that time is not going to be kind to that standpoint. Like there are very few very few hills that I will die on, let's say, in the paranormal areas. But one of those is the reality of psi phenomena, and I think that it's been practically proven through a lot of my heroes in that field, like Dean Radin and Rupert Sheldrake and Daryl Bem. Some really good, consistent experiments with laboratory controls, which may or may not be perfect, but a lot of them are pointing to the reality that there is something to psi phenomena. And if that's the case, and even the slightest little bit, then our current materialist model of the universe is fundamentally flawed. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that you should try to go walk through the wall right now. Like there's certain materialist rules that still apply. But as I like to say, if I add one color to a black and white film, you can no longer call it a black and white film because there's also something else at play there, right? So it doesn't take away from the black and white, but now there's an extra color. So I think that science is in the process of coming to grips with the fact that materialism is a falsified system, and I think that it's just going to get more and more open to that fact. And again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, like if that's the case, if our current understanding of the way that reality works in terms of matter and physicality being the fundamental building blocks of everything, then really a lot of other stuff comes flooding onto the table in terms of what these phenomena could be. So I think that in an effort to make short-term gains with modern science, they're really sort of people who are in the flesh and blood camp really sort of do themselves a disservice in the long term.
And when Moorhead finds prints that end in the middle of nowhere, what's this poor Bigfoot doing, walking backwards when he doesn't have to? I mean, the chances of anybody finding his footprints were pretty slim.
Yeah, I mean, it's the original definition of Occam's razor, right? Like, I mean, people
Right.
say that Occam's razor is like, oh, the simplest explanation is the most likely, and that's actually not what it says. It says you don't multiply variables unnecessarily. So while it might be simpler to say Bigfoot is an undiscovered ape versus Bigfoot is some sort of paranormal, supernatural, dimension hopping spirit, whatever, you're still multiplying variables unnecessarily by saying, well, Bigfoot is a flesh and blood primate that A is smart enough to tiptoe backwards through its tracks, B can jump higher and farther than any known living animal, C exhibits bioluminescence from its eyes, D, all these sort of different things. It's just it's if the flesh and blood hypothesis is correct, it is literally the most unique and remarkable animal on the planet.
Right.
Well, and especially too, because, every single flesh and blood Bigfooter, says this is an animal that does not want to be seen. Why then does it seem to go out of its way sometimes to literally make an appearance or to leave this evidence? Yet again, to me, that seems like, almost this nonsensical behavior exhibited by especially UFO occupants, or yeah, the
Exactly.
fairies, or yeah, any folkloric, entity.
It's what you're talking about with Simonson, right? It's the
Yeah,
theatrical aspect of it,
exactly. Yeah.
for the same reason that extraterrestrials don't need to take a tissue sample by coring out the center of my hand to collect DNA. Like,
Yeah.
come on, Blue Tark, let's go down to the CVS and they can swab my mouth for a 23andMe. Like, it seems so, a lot of this stuff seems so theatrical, which sort of brings to mind again that idea that we're living out these stories. We're living out these dramatized theatrical stories that are being brought to life whenever these experiences interact with us.
There almost seems to be, in some cases, though. I mean, you can go to the Northwest, and there are some instances where you have these sort of straightforward Bigfoot reports uh, with a low amount or no high strangeness. And then you look at the Bigfoots in Pennsylvania, southwest Pennsylvania, in 73, 74, and other places that have green glowing eyes, are unaffected by bullets or disappear when they're hit by bullets, and have all kinds of other theatrics going on around it. I mean, you open up your book, the volume one, where the footsteps end, talking about that bizarre encounter that was witnessed by several people, including a police officer, I believe, in Pennsylvania, where it looks like there's a landed craft there, but it disappears the moment the guy shoots at the Bigfoot that are crying, making noises like, I think was it crying sounds like baby, or was it a scream? But it just had all this different stuff going on. And then afterwards, the main witness acts like he's possessed, and he's stomping around on the field, growling and everything. I mean, and also I would think, I wonder what you think about this. Sometimes people say, well, did the UFO land, and did the Bigfoot step out? Or I'm not sure. When you talk about theater, I'm not sure we should look at it that way. I call these things paranormal dioramas. It's almost like the whole thing is set up, and you don't need A to B to C. You don't need to think of the thing as a landed craft that had a Bigfoot in it that they released for whatever reason. There might be something else completely going on.
I kind of like that idea of the diorama because there's an almost frivolous sort of connotation to it, right? Like, oh, this is just something we're setting up for fun.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense, but it's just an interesting combination. We're just going to set it up. I really like that. I mean, yeah. So that's the confounding thing, right? Is because you do have all this great. I mean, same thing with the UFO topic. You have this great stuff that really does seem to conform to the materialist version of what these things are. E.g.,
Right.
little green men and animals. But we've been talking about things being all or nothing. Like one idea that I've entertained that I really do kind of like. I brought it up with Tim, and I don't think he's as tolerant of it. But I like the idea. Looking at somebody like Mike Clelland's work with the owls and UFOs. Like, Mike is not going to tell you that there aren't real owls. Like, there are he's a sane person. Like there are real owls. There are
Right.
also owls that act really really strange, in conjunction with the uh, with the UFO phenomena. And I kind of wonder if we're not seeing, if I'm being charitable, right? I kind of wonder if we're not seeing something similar at play with the Bigfoot phenomena, where there is a small population of literally flesh and blood animals, that just so happen to be one of the more popular disguises for whatever this other intelligence that we interact is. Just
Ah,
similar,
yes.
similar to the way the
Mhm.
owls work. It's like, because you do have stories of strange animals that are mundane animals with an odd aspect to them. That's something that you see from time to time. So maybe we're dealing with something like that. That's my way of having my cake and eating it too. But
Well, didn't Zelia, didn't Keel come up with the idea of paranormal mimicry, the
Yeah.
idea that some of these things may actually be nuts and bolts or physical, but there's some aspect, and call it ultra terrestrials or human consciousness or whatever, that mimics it, but as a counterfeit?
Yeah, and I think too that that's a really interesting concept because you can see that also. I mean, even in the Black Shuck, yeah, dogs exist. Yet here we have these,
yes.
this symbol that's associated so heavily with something that is unexplained. Even the woman in white, yes, there are women, they wear white, but then you have these specters. So
Yeah.
I've entertained that thought a lot. And to hop on too to Keel's idea of kind of the reflective nature of things, that was that fantastic case where, he was noticing these synchronicities piling up when he would start.
Uh-oh. Zelia?
I lost her too.
Okay.
No.
Okay, we'll just vamp here for a minute. And let me type a message to Zelia. Okay, I've typed the message. And we will, I wonder if I have to, it looks like she's still here. Uh, so I wonder if I need to reconnect. Well, we'll see if I'll get her another way too. By the way, let's see what else was the next thing I was going to ask you. What if in a little bit of writing I've done, uh, sometimes you find out more information, you change your ideas. Is there anything major or even minor in the past that you've written where you think, oh, I need to add to that, or I have a whole different idea on that now?
Oh yeah. I mean, I still think one day I might go back to a Trojan feast and fold in a lot more of the stuff surrounding magical practice that I've learned about since then. Not as a practitioner, but just as viewing it through that sort of spirit offering lens is one area in which that book really is uh, is incomplete, I think. But as far as changing my opinion, like I kind of was on the everything is fairies bandwagon, and now I'm leaning more toward, well, so yeah, everything is fairies, and then sort of playing with this Jungian collective unconsciousness idea. But I've sort of very much to my chagrin come around to the idea that some of the stuff might not be us, and I don't mean like unorthodox aircraft in the sky. And I don't mean people making stuff up. I don't mean something that's all in your head. I mean like some aspect of us that doesn't exteriorize itself and sort of reflect and project back to us. Um, not only that, but also, again, like looking at, I think you can make a case. I'm doing it less, less efficiently than everybody else in this new book, but you can make a case that like this is all about death. It's all about things that are either pulling you to the beyond, or pushing us from the beyond, or like straight up ghosts. I mean, I don't really like that idea. I like it a little bit better than the idea of some sort of higher self, or some sort of exteriorized version of ourselves, some sort of polypsychic soul aspect. But um I really like to go places where I'm uncomfortable. A big part of the new book is going to be talking about aliens and reincarnation. Like I would avoid that stuff like the plague. It makes me uncomfortable,
Right.
right?
Yes,
Um
I know what you mean.
if I'm going to sit here and criticize people for not taking in data and not being, intellectually honest, then I have to say, okay, there's this giant body of stuff that talks about aliens playing a role in reincarnation. What are you going to do with that, Josh? And I have to do something with it, because if it's like Terrence McKenna once said, if it's real, it can handle the pressure. Well, if your ideas are consistent and well thought out, they should be able to handle the pressure. So we'll
Okay,
see.
I, I
Yeah,
think I think Ms. Edgar has rejoined.
Sorry about that, guys.
That's
I
all
am
right.
back in business.
you were in the middle of a great thought too. I was waiting
Of
with bated breath.
course. Of course. I'm
Yeah,
telling you, it's the Men in Black.
right.
Yes, please. I don't remember exactly where you left off, but if you remember, would you like to continue?
Boy, well, I have no idea when it cut out, but I was talking about how let's see, Keel with the reflective thing. So yeah,
Yes.
how there's dogs, there's women in white, there's all these things that seem to be models, almost symbolic patterns for whatever this other is. And on top of that, the reflective nature of things. Keel, I guess, was noticing all these synchronicities piling up. When he was doing his research, he would talk about a new theory with someone, and then all of a sudden, it seemed like the cases would go out of their way to confirm that concept. And so, as an experiment, he thought really hard one day, well, maybe, these men in black, maybe they're aquatic. And I guess that literally later that week, he got an account from someone saying that they had run in with a men in black type character. And when he pulled down his turtleneck, he had gills. And so, there you have something which seems to just be a dead giveaway that there is some element of whatever this, just blanket unexplained phenomena is that can manipulate itself to conform to our expectations.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that, because while you were off the air, we were talking about the idea that some aspect of this, or all aspects of this, might not be some part of ourselves that's exteriorized. And when you see stuff like that, where Keel is sort of generating almost like a reality field around him, right?
Yeah.
Him coming up with ideas that are confirmed, but they seem to be tailor made to confirm with him, kind of does support that aspect. And I don't like it. I don't like that
Yeah.
idea. I want there to be some sort of, uh, you know, objectively externalized aspect to this phenomena. But
Yeah.
it may be a part of us looking back at ourselves. And again, if you're gonna be honest, like, you gotta consider that.
For the longest time, I thought that the laws that govern the paranormal were as immutable and as fixed as any other physical laws. Uh, Forgetting about quantum physics, because that just messes everything up. But and I thought maybe we just don't understand them, but we will at some point. But now I wonder. I mean, it's almost like you have this the interface between substance or matter and consciousness, and you know how matter breaks down into nothing. You said, well, we still can't go through walls, but you might think we could, with the space in between all the little electrons and mesons and all those minuscule particles. But where does we have all these traditions where thoughts are things, and you can in goal setting, in we become embarrassed, a mental thought, and it reflects on our face physically. Poor Schrodinger's cat, we don't know if that sucker's alive or dead, but it all has to do with the observation of the scientist. So you have, where, in other words, where does this interface begin and end? Substance, matter, and consciousness. And I just wonder if, and I don't have it very well formed, but I just wonder if the laws that govern the paranormal, if they are laws at all, uh, lie in that realm. And if they do, perhaps they are not subject to immutable laws at all. They're more like you got the trickster on his throne, just messing with us sometimes.
Well, I would argue that not even the laws of reality are immutable laws. I mean, honestly, I have a great deal of respect for science. I think that sometimes it's used by people who are a little bit more religious than scientific in their application of it. But there are there are areas of science today that would have gotten you laughed at, a couple decades ago. And a lot of it starts to sound like quasi-religious proclamations. I mean, I know just because I can't understand quantum physics doesn't mean that it's not real, but I'll be damned if this idea that there are, multitudes of infinite dimensions doesn't start to sound like a proclamation that shouldn't be taken on some degree of faith that these people know what they're talking about, right? And I guess I'm saying that to say that I completely lost I completely lost the thread I was talking about. What was the question again?
Yes, I was just talking about how matter and substance, it interfaces with consciousness, and
Right. Okay. Yeah.
the
I know where I
laws.
was going with this. Yeah.
In
Well,
other words,
that,
I didn't know what the hell I was talking about
well,
either. So
and that's the other thing that you see is like, I mean, there was a point in time at the end of the 19th century where parents were actively encouraging their kids to not go into science because like we were all done sciencing, right? There was nothing else to
right,
discover. And then everything gets turned over and we figure out that it's like that habits of highly productive people, like one of the things that they warn against is to make sure that when you're climbing the ladder it's propped up against the right wall, right? Well, we keep on flipping finding new
Yeah.
walls to prop the ladder against. And I have friends who work at like JPL who still don't realize that like it's all a castle of sand. Like you can accomplish some things, sure, but like the fundamentals might be a castle of sand. Um, but it does seem to me that a lot of these things that even in the natural world, to heck with the supernatural, the natural world, tend to behave like really, 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 really strong guidelines rather than laws,
right.
Um, and that's sort of what I think the scientific establishment has been edging towards for the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years for certain.
Well, when you think about it, not to get too off in religion or spirituality, but there are people that have averted car accidents and physical problems by their mental input, by turning to a higher power or whatever. And if that's true and if that works, they are definitely changing the laws of physics. We've all heard cases what people would call miracles, and so yes, that there are times when people through the state of their consciousness, I think, does actually change the outcome of a physical act. Oh, go ahead.
No,
Okay.
well,
Okay.
what I was going to add to that was, yeah, it's interesting and sort of a point of frustration about the small-mindedness of some people who are not all scientists, but some people who are involved in the sciences. They can't conceive of the fact that there might be, I'm not necessarily invoking God here, but an intelligence that supersedes uh, their authority, so that
Right.
if it doesn't want to be measured in a lab, it's not going to be measured in a lab. Like if I
Mhm.
don't want my toddler to get my phone and I'm holding my phone, he's never going to get my phone. Every now and then he might grab it, right? But I can yank it out of his hands real quick. You know what I mean? And I kind of wonder if we're not dealing with a similar relationship with the supernatural. To say nothing of the fact that these aren't phenomena that seem to be conducive to laboratory settings. And that might be sort of a George P. Hansen trickster model of that being too structured of environment, or it just might be
That's right.
or it just might be the fact that, you don't measure the tide in a sink. So now imagine a tide that you can't find a rhyme or reason to where it's going to happen. You're never going to be able to measure this thing, right?
Mhm.
So I kind of get frustrated that a lot of people who demand the paranormal answer to the scientific method don't realize that the scientific method is great for repeatable things, but when you're dealing with something that might have some sort of superseding authority, it's absolutely useless.
Right.
Possibly, and again, maybe I'm not being dogmatic about this. I'm just saying, can we, you know, at least engage with that idea in an honest way?
Right. But well, it's the people that want to deny it won't. I mean, they'll hang on to science and they'll say it's not repeatable. Well, remember, I think it was Colin Kelleher talking about the NIDS program when they were on the Skinwalker Ranch, how they had hundreds of separate incidents and virtually nothing repeated itself. But here they were trying to apply the scientific method, and it just didn't work for them.
Yeah.
I did have another. I wanted to mention the people that look at Bigfoot as a flesh and blood perspective. Some of them have actually conceded that there are some stranger aspects to Bigfoot, but they seem to use infrasound as the magic bullet to kind of
Hmm.
explain all the weird stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
and you mentioned that in your book too, that seems to be the catch-all these days for all the magic that Bigfoot can perform.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of when Stanton Friedman was sort of cornered about some of the telepathic or synchronistic aspects of
Yes.
some cases. Maybe it was the Betty and Barney Hill cases, but he was like, "Well, I'm sure if you have enough advanced technology, you can do stuff like that." And it's like, okay, that's neat. That and yeah, it's same thing with the infrasound. Oh, you forgot. The Bigfoot disappeared in front of you. Oh, well, he zapped you with infrasound and disoriented you, so you didn't notice it disappearing. You felt an ominous feeling. Oh, that was the infrasound. Any number of things are attributed
Right.
to this miraculous infrasound, and it's even if that's at play, which I think is whoever came up with it it's a really good hypothesis.
Right. And may in fact be true in some cases.
And it may be true, but can we at least not use it as a catch-all? Can it do like 3 things instead of like 20 things? Yeah, it becomes a point of frustration. At the same time, I think that there might be something sort of encoded in that idea that everybody's overlooking, which is the idea that the sound itself might actually be a facilitator to create some sort of altered state of consciousness, which might be where a lot of these more fantastic elements creep in. Like maybe the mundane Bigfoot sightings are the sightings where you don't get hit with infrasound and slip into this altered state. Something like that. Like that's a more interesting idea for me than just saying, oh, anything strange is ultrasound.
You've been on the 6 Degrees of John Keel podcast, I think.
Yes, I love those ladies.
Yes, yeah, they were on my show once. A lot of fun. And Morgana mentioned an experience she had one night. She had a friend of hers was over late at night, and I'm trying to think. One of them heard like a baby crying, like the one of the standard poltergeist manifestations. The other one heard a beeping sound at the same time. Now we hear reports in like John Keel, his people that saw the Mothman would hear these electronic beeps outside their trailer or on the telephone, and people would hear the baby crying. The way she put it, and it sounds logical to me, it could possibly signal in noise. Perhaps one of them was just hearing it as an electronic beep, and the other one, it was somehow transformed into a baby crying. But it was the same, apparently the same sound, or at least at the same time, 2 people hearing it differently. And that was kind of blew my mind.
Well, it comes back to, I was just talking about this the other night, some of the stuff that my mentor, Greg Bishop, talks about with his ideas about co-creation, and that, whatever this is sort of working with us to create part of the experience. You encounter something that uses some mechanism, I would like to say endogenous DMT, and looks through your brain and says, "Oh, I see that you have a nice wardrobe of Bigfoot outfits. Let's pick this really goofy looking one." And then that's what it appears as. But you also see this with people. You'll have a group of 5 people, and 3 will see a green UFO and 2 will see a red UFO, or 4 will see a UFO and 1 will not see anything at all, which really does to me point to the consciousness aspect. And for anybody who thinks it sounds kind of goofy, I'm sure that we've all had the experience of someone cooking. I don't know. Let's say someone's cooking brownies, right? And they say, "Come here, I want you to try this." And before you can look, they pop something in your mouth. And it's like a hot dog, right? And and you're expecting them to like give you a little bit of brownie batter. And for a moment, even though you love brownies and you love hot dogs, for a moment, it's the most disgusting thing you've ever had in your mouth, right? Because your expectations just are misaligned. So if you can scale that up, how much of our expectations really do influence perception?
Yes. Boy, I just had this always happens to me. I have this great question, and then it gets elusive. Well, the perception is something that is a real key element in all this, and people have, Oh, I know what I was going to say. I'm glad I got it. Zelia has done some great YouTube videos on these one-off creatures. We got your basic Bigfoot, sometimes variations. You got your basic water monster, this and that. But every once in a while, you get something that just doesn't make any sense, and people tend to want to reject it because it's not. What was that one Bigfoot-like creature, Zelia in California near Battle Creek
Oh
Bridge?
yeah,
Yeah.
the flight suit entity.
Yes.
Gosh, yeah, that thing was just, and that was such a bizarre case because it was heavily tied to, light anomalies. And so it's like, it was kind of locked in at the time. I believe that occurred in the early 70s, if I'm not mistaken. At the time, it was extensively researched by, APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, as kind of a UFO related case. But then ultimately, there wasn't like necessarily a craft. So it's like, we call it a UFO occupant, even though there's nothing that even conforms to that concept of a craft which it could occupy. And then in addition to that, too, there was this one light anomaly which they were seeing all of these orbs as they fled the scene. And there was one alongside the road that kind of assembled itself into a humanoid figure made out of light, which just reminds me of, oh gosh, Steve, I think it was Paul Devereaux who said that oftentimes these
Yes.
entities appear to be comprised of the same material as their so-called flying saucer. So that case was absolutely wild. And then one of the witnesses, even later on, and again, maybe this is related, maybe it's absolutely unrelated, ended up being a serial killer. So, I mean, that was just a genuine, so many of these cases, at first glance, you're like, oh, some people saw something weird. Maybe there were a few lights in the sky involved. And you can kind of be like, okay, well, maybe it's UFO related. But then all of a sudden, as time goes on, and you keep looking at the small details. So many of these are actually three-ring circuses of just absolute weirdness and high strangeness. And it's not uncommon at all for that to be the case.
Paul Devereaux called these things proto-entities, and they were situations where the orb or what appeared to be the craft seemed to be inseparable from the entity. And there's an incident like that on the Skinwalker Ranch where this thing is supposed to have climbed out of a hole in space, and it was sort of had the substance of a Bigfoot, but it had no face and it had no hair. And Zelia, you did the one on was it the Enfield Horror, a
Yes.
three-legged beast? Yes.
With eyes like flashlights. I absolutely love that case because yet again, it's just kind of unclassifiable. It's like it had three legs, it had these little clawed talon-like hands, and then giant pink flashlight eyes. Someone who actually made physical contact with it claimed that not only did it somehow just instantly shred his sneaker, but it was also kind of rubbery and covered in slime. I think that like some people tend to place it almost like with like the phantom kangaroos, but that's still a far cry from a kangaroo. And again, too, this doesn't fit into your classic cryptid where it's like conventional thinking dictates you have to have a population. They have to live in an area. That area has to be able to support them. I don't know where the heck this thing comes from that, it would fit in there. It
Well,
just,
a
yeah.
population and hopefully some sort of chain of custody in the fossil record, right? I mean, that's the
Yeah.
reason why when people talk about Dogman and Sheep Squatch being cryptids, I kind of roll my eyes because there's just no. I mean, talk about something that is a complete aberration, and then people say,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, maybe it's a mutation." Well, that's not really the way mutations work. Maybe it's a government experiment. Well, I guess maybe it's still not usually the way that works. It's yeah.
And of course, Linda Godfrey found that there were clusters of dogman reports in southern Wisconsin that
Mhm.
seemed to align almost perfectly with certain types of mounds, like panther mounds and
Yep.
water spirit mounds. And it's very, very difficult to put the dogman into a physical category. One of my thoughts in these one-off creatures is, Keel, who talked a lot about transmogrifications of energy, and maybe he's right. Maybe these things just sort of it's Dr. Donald Ormond called it the phantom menagerie, which I think is the perfect name for it. But Keel was not concerned about what the creature looked like or how many portholes the craft had. He thought that these things were that perhaps the only objectively real thing about some of these may be the strange lights, and that people were like co-creating, like you were talking, or being affected in one way or the other. And he wanted to, what did he call he wanted to find the cosmic mechanism behind these things. So maybe that's where we have to go.
Well, the lights are the most common aspect. I mean,
Mhm.
they're attached to literally every single paranormal entity that I can think of. And the idea that I've been playing with lately is that, the pineal gland functions on light exposure, because it's where we produce melatonin. Evolutionarily speaking, it is, a third eye of sorts. And maybe there isn't some very specific spectrum that these light entities inhabit that allows us to flood our brains with DMT from the pineal gland, which is present. DMT is present in the pineal gland. Still, verdict's still out. Jury's still out on whether or not it's produced there. But like, if that model holds, that DMT is produced in the pineal gland, then perhaps there might be some sort of spectrum of light that can trigger a huge endogenous dump of DMT, and then that's where you get the whole co-creation thing coming in, and that's like, okay, well, now, no, this is the field upon which we shall meet after I shine this weird light in your face. Because you hear these UFO stories, right, and ghost light stories, etc., and almost invariably it's always like, well, yeah, it was like a strange sort of light that I'd never seen before. It had this unearthly quality. I can't really describe how it was different, but it was just different than anything I'd ever seen. And I think it's something that is worth exploring for sure.
Even I have. Oh, go ahead, Zelia.
No, even, so many, classically considered cryptid entities with the eye shine, which then upon further inspection seems to be just, self-luminous eyes. I think that Keel even mentioned that he often believed that if there was a light in the eye of the entity, that might be the only objectively real thing about it. And then one more thing. I feel like Columbo, just one more thing. Jenny Randalls also pointed out that a lot of her repeater witnesses to either UFO phenomena or a combination of UFO and, some sort of psychic ability or ghost phenomena often had very early encounters in their youth with lights, especially orbs of light. So anyway, Steve, go on.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say even I have my it's open-minded as I am to these stranger aspects. When I hear reports of people seeing a craft and looking through the window and seeing a Bigfoot driving the damn thing, that makes me want to fall back on Keel's. Don't worry about the manifestation, because perhaps that's not what's really going on. So there's even for those of us that look into this, the stranger aspects, there's always something that seems to push the envelope to the point where this just can't be real. But there was some cases like that in your book of really bizarre Bigfoot reports.
Well, what's interesting to me is that there was a point, and you probably remember this. I'm not saying that you're an old timer, but
I am
kind of saying you're an old timer. But you've been involved in this a lot longer than I have. There was a time when people used to point and snicker at the repeaters. That used to be like, oh yes, you're a repeater, right? And now it's turned such that I find the repeaters to be more believable, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. And there really are encounter-prone personalities. That sort of is what Zelia was getting at.
Even Dr. Hynek and Ted Phillips, early on, they would reject people that said they saw a UFO again, and then later on they realized that was the wrong thing to do.
Yeah, and if you look at sort of like a lot of the Bigfoot stuff, you will find that it's always the people who see like a one-off sighting of Bigfoot. They're the ones who say that it's a flesh and blood creature, right? That's it's like, oh well, that's I'm telling you, it was a damn dirty ape because I saw it through the lens of my hunting rifle. But when you talk to the people who have these longitudinal experiences, longitudinal experiences that are very much location based, like a haunting, I might add.
Yeah.
They're the ones who start to say, yeah, Bigfoot, and also my house is haunted, and things fly off the shelves, and wouldn't you believe it, I saw a 3-foot owl, and there were strange lights on the property. That's where all the weirdness really does seem to happen. And of course, you've got to ask yourself, is it the property or is it the person?
Well, Keel, and we'll probably wrap up things here pretty soon, but I hope you come back, Joshua, because we just barely scratched the surface. Keel, he advanced the field so much. He found that his catchphrase was, "Ask the contactee what they had for breakfast," which meant find out all about them.
Yep.
And so when I talked to a lady, and I've told the story a million times, in New Hampshire, she and her husband had some missing time. They saw a strange craft, and with a few questions, I found out her children had both seen orbs. She saw a shadow person. Two of her family members saw a strange cryptid near the property. So not just repeaters, but people seem to be tuned in somehow. Not like me. I mean, I had a possessed TV set one time in a motel room, and I unplugged it. That's it. But yeah, so certain people, and Keel gets is one of these people that gets trashed, still gets trashed. So it just there's certain people that have really advanced the field. Zelia, before we start to wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we go?
Oh gosh. See, you asked me that question. I'm like,
I know we could actually go another hour, but I think we should probably wrap it up soon, and then we'll just maybe in a couple months, if Joshua will come back, it'll be great.
See, I've almost gotten to the point where I like talking to people that I don't have a lot in common with, because then we can keep the conversation nice and compressed. Because inevitably, whenever I find kindred spirits, it's always like, okay, well, 2 hours are up and we barely talked about any things we had planned. It always happens.
I know this is like I'm opening a can of worms here. I could be here all day, but I guess the one thing that's been on my mind lately, and this goes all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, and I just have to say it's so refreshing, kind of how you mentioned this whole thing with disclosure, because I have been asked about that so many times, and the truth of the matter is, now that that report is out, personally, the way I look at it, I feel like it's kind of a very dangerous thing, because what I'm seeing is a lot of sort of canning the phenomena into it being solely physical. And I guess I just wanted to get your, quick take on that as we're like heading out here.
I'm glad you asked that, because Joshua, you wrote a kind of a piece on Facebook not too long ago about disclosure.
Yeah, a little salty there, but
perfect.
Well, I mean, so I find it really frustrating. Most of my frustrations are filtered through the lens of UFO Twitter. I left Twitter in late 2019, and it was like the best decision for my mental health at the time that I could ever do. Thought it might be nice to have conversations with people who are of like minds, but really I'm gonna make this blanket statement. Like, UFO Twitter is just if you talk to them about books that they should have read, they said you're elitist. And if you talk to them about history that they should know, they should say, oh, well, it's different now, or any number of things. And it really, a lot of the expectations that people tend to heap on this latest disclosure, I think were woefully under-informed by the past. I kind of don't know where to begin. I think part of it is crowdsourcing skywatching, since we are in the middle of Cold War 2.0, which is another thing that people tend to forget. And not only is it an ignorance of UFO history, it's an ignorance of just world history. In the first Cold War, UFO groups were infiltrated by the military for similar purposes, to get an idea of what people were seeing in the sky, to see if people were seeing anything, domestic or foreign. I think I have a thought about the, cramming it into the physicalist hole that you mentioned. And where I kind of, in my more conspiratorial moments, go with it is that, I've been involved in the field in a relatively short amount of time, right? 6 years is when I started really immersing myself into this and listening obsessively to podcasts and cataloging stuff in my brain. But even in that short amount of time, I saw a marked change in the UFO dialogue. People were talking about altered states of consciousness. People were talking about, the sort of imaginal collective unconsciousness realm. People were talking about trickster phenomena. People were talking about all these other things besides the ETH in really open ways, in a fashion that I could see changing from the time that I got in until 2017, 2018. So that's just 3 or 4 years, right? And then the New York Times article drops, and then TTSA comes out. And then, this continuing encouragement of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and I almost wonder if it wasn't a managed expectation in some ways. Like they said, okay, well, it looks like the community is getting a little bit too close to. Sorry, the sheep are straying away from the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which we know to be patently untrue. Again, this is my more conspiratorial moments when I think this. We know that ETH is untrue, but we want to steer them that way because that keeps their noses off the scent of what's actually going on. And sometimes I wonder if that's not what was happening, because you have all these people falling in line with official channels. You have a bunch of, ex-intelligence officials involved with the To the Stars Academy, etc. It's just all, as Chris O'Brien once said, once a spook, always spooky, right? You kind of have all these people who seem to be playing in those areas. So I kind of wonder if it's not a managed way to deliberately push towards the materialist explanation, exactly like you were saying, Zelia. And I think that, again, in my more conspiratorial areas, I imagine that the government really knows one of two things. The first being that they don't know anything about the phenomena really much more than we do. They just have a bigger data set, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
The
they
other
don't want to admit it.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're afraid that the private sector will actually be able to do something with it, right?
Right.
Or they, again, in my rich fantasy world, this is what's happening. They realize that the implications of the UFO phenomena that they have been able to determine reinforce the fact that you are an enduring consciousness of some sort in a universe where literally anything is possible. I mean, it's like I've said before, like, which is more upending of your worldview? That Close Encounters of the Third Kind is what reality looks like, or that the Iliad is what reality looks like, And I can tell you which one would affect my daily life more.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wonder if it's not like, oh dear, we can't let people know about the fact that they actually are immortal in some sense, because that's where our authority as a governing structure ends, right? Like if our ultimate punishment for you is, imprisoning you for just this life or ending this life, and you continue in some form or fashion, then we lose all power to control you. So that's where my really conspiratorial mind goes with it. But I do think that you're right and perceptive in saying that there does seem to be a reflexive shift back towards the materialist, back towards the nuts and bolts, back towards the ETH. And I kind of wonder if that's not exactly what they were going for.
And didn't you write that ultimately disclosure is a personal thing from within?
Yeah, I was talking with sometime in 2020. I was talking with Whitley Strieber about this, and we sort of both came to the conclusion, like, you're not going to get it from anybody, because I don't necessarily mean it in a religious sense, but like it kind of is a spiritual path, learning about UFOs and the paranormal. It's an alchemical path. It's a path of checking your own biases. It's a path of checking your own beliefs, and it sort of is a path of, if you do it right, I think, personal betterment, of opening your mind, of admitting your own shortcomings and admitting what you don't know. It really has all the earmarks of that sort of spiritual path. And in that sense, like, the government is the last place you get that, And I don't think that you will ever get. Well, you might get a declaration that we're being visited by aliens, but I think that might be manipulated and false flaggy and all that sort of stuff. But you're the only person that needs convincing about this stuff, right? Like, you don't need the government to come up and tell you that, UFOs are genuinely anomalous, which is the big takeaway from, the report that was released. Like, you don't need the government to tell you that. If you are open-minded and you're examining this data set, like, you can come to that conclusion yourself. So what are you really after? You're after that own personal gnosis. You're not after any sort of government officially sanctioned narrative that UFOs are anomalies.
Could you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I got my mute slide here. I couldn't remember if I had it on the right side. So I'm glad you can hear me. Uh, yes, and I agree. I was kind of disappointed that it seems to be moving toward strictly nuts and bolts. But that
Hmm.
being said, because my thinking isn't static and Keel's never was, I've come to believe that there probably is an aspect of this. I mean, we all think all three of us agree that there's not one answer here, but I've come to believe that some of this probably does deal with some other intelligence, and the research of Bob Pratt. UFO danger
Hmm.
zone, the bizarre abduction attempts in Brazil. I was able to talk to Bill Ray, one of the original remote viewers that studied under Ingo Swann on Mac Maloney's show. And some of the stuff that they saw as the remote viewing, I tend to think that some of this probably does deal with some other intelligence, whatever it may be. But which, I don't, I'd rather it just be one thing. There's somebody I went to, I had a visit to the Point Pleasant last weekend, and one of the guys told me, he said, well, that's a cop out. And I said, well, no, here's my when I give my talk at the Bigfoot conference, if I don't get pelted with rotten tomatoes, here's the idea is this: we have to listen to what people say, listen to what they report. I mean, I had my preconceived notions back in the '60s. If I was frozen in the 1960s, I never would have asked that lady in New Hampshire about all these other questions. But I was trained by John Keel, I mean, as a mentor that I never met. So, when you open your mind to these things, you can. It just gives you more information to deal with. But so anyway, that's leaving on a note. I think there's more than one answer, and perhaps perhaps Josh will write his next book on that.
Oh man, let's see if I survive this. Let's see if I survive this one I'm working on first.
Well, I'm actually going to cover it in a book that I'm writing, which should be out sometime this decade. But we'll see what happens. But anyway, Joshua, tell us how people can contact you and how they can find your books.
JoshuaCutchin.com,
Oh, I'm sorry.
JOSHUA.
I've been saying Cutchin. It's Cutchin.
Oh,
My
that's fine.
apologies.
I tend to not correct people on things like that because I don't know. It's not a big deal. Trust me. When you have a name spelled like mine, you get all
I
sorts of
appreciate it.
pronunciations. So,
Well,
Je-
poor David Politis. David
oh
Politis.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Pilates, Pilates.
Yes. Right.
Yeah. JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. And links to all my books there. If you can get my books through a brick and mortar store, that's sort of the way I prefer that people do it because I'm all about bookstores. But I realize that that is not always practical nor a viable option. So if you have to, go to Amazon and Barnes and Noble and check that out. You can also listen to every interview I've ever done in the history of ever is also linked there. And someday, I keep on saying this, I've been saying this for like 5 years now. So someday I will be good at keeping up the blog. But right now I'm just focusing on so much long form stuff that I might not get around to it. So, yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. And Zelia, I'm so glad that you were able to share this with me as co-host today.
Oh yeah, this was just really awesome. And yeah, Josh, this was just super neat talking with you. Truly, I am such an admirer of your work. So this was fantastic. Thanks for inviting me on, Steve.
My pleasure. And again, thank you, Joshua Cutchin. I
Absolute
got it
pleasure,
right.
y'all.
All right. Everybody sit tight. I'm going to close out the show.
Okay.
The High Strangeness Factor was created by Steve Ward and Andy Mercer and is copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I want to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, our fearless leaders here at the network. I also want to thank Andy Mercer in his capacity as producer for the show. And I want to thank Brian Zeller, who composed the theme music for the High Strangeness Factor. I can also be heard weekly as a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, and it can be found on the same network as this show. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Yank here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thank you for listening. I will see you all again in a fortnight. Take care.